history of the King James text, politics of printing is what we're looking at in this particular lesson. Okay? So, introduction. So, since resuming class, so this would have been like last month. Since resuming class, we have been focusing on the printed history of the King James text during the 1630s. We've been focusing on the lesser Cambridge and London printings during the 1630s. We did that in lesson 237, as well as the 1638 Cambridge Folio edition, and we spent 3 lessons looking at that. Lesson 238, 239, and 240. Are we on YouTube?
I'm trying to find it. Facebook. Do not see anything on YouTube. Put that in my phone when we showed a black screen last time. So. Just Facebook. Looks like just Facebook.
So we're not live on YouTube? See, we had this problem last week. I'm seeing myself right now. Right? On YouTube?
Yeah, I don't see anything on YouTube for live or notifications for Grace.
Oh, it's because it's unlisted. Why is it unlisted? What's that? Anyway, we're going to go ahead with Facebook, and I can mess with videos later. Anyway, we've been looking at the text in 1630s, and in doing so, we concluded that there were 3 forms of the AV text available in the 1630s, emanating from 3 different publishers: London, Cambridge, and Edinburgh. Then in lesson 240, we added a 4th by looking at a 1642 publication of the AV emanating from Amsterdam that included the Geneva Bible marginal notes. So we talked about that briefly last time. So by 1642, you've got at least 4 forms of the text. London, Cambridge, Edinburgh, and Amsterdam are publishing different forms of the text. In this lesson, we want to continue looking at the printed history of the text by considering the politics and market conditions of the 17th century English Bible market after the publication of the 1638 Cambridge Folio edition. So this is interesting stuff to think through what's going on with printing. So I've titled this point, Politics of Printing. M.H. Black, in his book, Cambridge University Press, 1584 to 1984, reports the following story regarding the 1638 Cambridge Folio edition. Quote, that Buck and Daniel, those were the publishers of the university, in their pride, in the 1638 edition, put a notice on Great St. Mary's door offering a free Bible to anyone who could find an error. So that's a pretty bold statement, okay? I'm not sure. I think that's probably somewhat of a fictitious statement, but let's keep going. While this story is probably apocryphal, okay, so i.e. false, Professor Norton highlights the importance of the 1629 and 1638 folio editions to the Cambridge University Press. Quote, the first 2 Cambridge folios were indeed remarkably well printed, quite outdating the efforts of the King's printer. This was in a real sense a commercial move. So that's interesting. If it's a commercial move, is it going to be economic? Okay. Black acknowledges that the story of Buck and Daniel's offer is probably apocryphal, but adds that Cambridge still had cause for pride, for it had inaugurated the tradition of care for the text, which only the 2 universities maintained. So that would be Oxford and Cambridge, okay? And which was to be always the strongest argument for their exemption from the monopoly conferred by the royal printer's patent. So remember what we've already studied, right? That the King's printer had a patent. He paid a lot of money for it to give him exclusive rights to print. He had the market cornered totally from 1611 until 1629 when Cambridge prints their first folio edition. Into the 1630s, he's got challenges coming from Cambridge because they start printing lesser editions. So now for the first time, the King's printer is facing competition in the market, right? And Cambridge is arguably producing a superior product. The text is better. It's been edited. the errors and so forth that were in the London printings are being cleaned up to a larger degree. And so the text that Cambridge is printing is superior to what the King's printer is doing coming out of London. According to Norton, royal permission to print the AV text became a reliable income stream for both Oxford and Cambridge, thereby allowing them to publish other staples of English literature and culture. So the point here is this. Are Oxford and Cambridge making money off printing the Bible? The money that they make off printing the Bible is probably far exceeding anything else that they're printing, which is allowing them to have funds to print other things that are important. Okay, let's look at the quote. In due course, Bible printing became a prime source of income for both Oxford and Cambridge University presses, subsidizing many unprofitable but important ventures without which English culture would have been the poorer. So that's to say that are they able to publish other things and bear the costs because of the money they're making off of printing the Bible? Make a modern comparison if I could. Most of these major universities in the United States, their entire athletic programs are funded off of the money made by football. So the money that the University of Michigan takes in from their football program largely funds everything else the athletic department does. That's how much money the football program makes in a given year. Okay, so it's not an exact comparison, but it's the same kind of idea. Okay. Footnote 27 in Norton's A Textual History of the King James Bible contains the following quote from David McKitterick's. Is that right? McKitterick's A History of Cambridge University Press, quote, by the mid-17th century, the Bible had become one of, speaking of Cambridge Press's mainstays, and it has maintained the most important single component of the press's list for most of the 3.5 centuries since. So he's arguing that even today, what is Cambridge making the most money off of?
Bible printing.
Printing the Bible, okay? Its importance as the generator of profits that could in turn be used to subsidize less wildly popular books can hardly be overestimated. So that's a couple different people who are bearing record to the fact that if Cambridge isn't publishing the biblical text, they're probably not able to afford to publish certain other things, okay? Professor Norton points out that if printing the Bible kept Oxford and Cambridge solvent, the same would be true for other publishers. In his work, A History of Cambridge University Press, author David McKitterick references another piece by William Kilburn, who we've already seen, titled Proposals Humbly Presented to Public Consideration, but more practically the Right Honorable Subcommittee of the Parliament for Religion concerning the future printing of Bibles in English. You gotta love the titles these guys put on things, okay? So this is fundamentally a petition to Parliament regarding the printing of the English Bible, okay? In this piece, Kilburn claimed that printers, quote, may gain by printing in all volumes, okay? I have this at what, 10,000 pounds? That's the way I understand that statement, okay? Per annum declaro, which means translated for a year from the clear, meaning that's their what? That they're clearing profit, that much money from this. That's the way I understand that statement, okay? An amount worth more than $2.4 million in today's money, according to Eric Nye's Pounds Sterling to Dollars Historical Conversion Currency website, and I've included the screenshot there of the calculation. So I ran the calculation at the year 1660, because that's roughly when Kilburn published the piece. The target year is this year, and then the amount of pounds I've entered is the number there, and that comes out to roughly $2,421,678.95. So, suffice it to say, is Kilburn saying that these guys are making a lot of money? Okay, so is there a profit to be had through Bible printing during this time period? Okay, now I don't need to tell you that if there's a profit to be had, is that going to attract people into the market to try to get a piece of that, to try to get a piece of that pie, as it were? Okay, so Kilburn believed that, left unchecked, The prospect of profits would lead to production of Bibles that did not meet the standards set by Cambridge University Press. Norton cites McKitterick to present Kilburn's case that, quote, no group such as the Stationers Company should, and here's where the quote starts, have any interest or title in the copy of the Bible or any propriety in the printing thereof. For if they or any of them have liberty to manage any printery, they will expose to sale no books but their own printing, and thereby having an advantage of powerful purse will debilitate, right? And discourage all others that print never so well. And in truth, if a book will but sell well, as Bibles are the most certain, let the printing be never so bad, they look no further. That's a kind of a real wordy way of saying essentially what? Right. If they allow this to occur, are they going to push everyone out of the market and be able to control it? Okay? And if they do that, are they going to be concerned necessarily with good, accurate printing, or are they mostly going to be concerned with just making what? Money. Okay? Top page 3. Any questions so far? Comments? Okay. Norton summarizes Kilburn's argument as follows. On the heels of poorly printed text would come the demise of quality printers and a rise in cost to the public through monopoly pricing. That's essentially what he's saying, okay? So Kilburn is concerned, number one, about accurate printing, and number two, he's concerned with what? The monopolistic competition that certain publishers have over the text and what the impact is going to be upon that, okay? Archbishop George Abbott, who had been one of the original King James translators, complained about high prices and declining print quality. Quote, I knew the time when greater care was had about printing. The Bibles especially, good compositors and the best correctors were gotten being grave and learned men, and the paper and letter rare and fair, every way of the best. But now the paper is not, the composers boys, and the correctors unlearned. So is he really complaining? Yeah. Okay? There is a farmer, I think this means monopolist in the context, okay? And he makes the benefit and the care for nothing about it. They heretofore spent their whole time in printing, but these look to gain, nothing else. So is he also complaining about the conditions that are existing at this time? Okay? Again, any questions or comments?
Kind of rubs against the narrative that it was getting polished.
It kind of rubs against some significant King James only narratives, that's for sure. Okay? The impression that I always had and the stuff that I read was that it doesn't seem to have gone that way in actual fact. Okay? But yeah, let's move on for now. In 1641, a London bookseller named Michael Spark wrote a 4-page tract titled Scintilla, which sheds light on the inflated price of books during the early 1640s. A.S. Herbert reproduces this tract in its entirety in his historical catalog, along with some introductory commentary on pages 182 through 187. States the following in part regarding the tract. Quote, a scarce tract entitled Scintilla, printed in 1641, which throws a flood of light on the prices of Bibles and the general book-selling trade in the early 17th century, is here presented in extensio, in full. Professor Abner included it in his Transcript of the Register's Stationers' Company, Volume 4, 1877, pages 35 through 38. But from its bearing on history of the English Bible, it comes a place in the catalog. In other words, it's becoming that it's there. Abner sums up the value of Scintilla, right? Scintilla. As follows, quote, "The tract is a remarkable testimony to the never-ending competition in the book trade, to the power of the king's printers, partly as patentees and partly as capitalists only, to the vast extent, proportionally to other books of the production of Bibles, etc., and school books under the early Stuarts, and lastly to their steady rise in price, despite the much larger editions then formerly owing in some degree to increased wealth of the country, but still more through monopolies and, quote, rigging the market." So he's going to be talking about how they're rigging the market conditions to their benefit, right? "If it will be seen that Scintilla," well, that needs to be in italics, Mike, if you're marking notes, okay, "also gives interesting details as to the importation of English scriptures printed in Holland." Okay? So, in other words, this piece is a sort of tell-all regarding what's going on in the English book market in 1641, coming out of the 1630s. The author was a London bookseller named Michael Spark, a native of Ensham, near Oxford, who died at Hampstead 29 December 1653. More than once, he infringed copyrights. So this guy knows what he's talking about because was he involved in this, okay? He infringed copyrights and dared to even attack the Bible monopoly of Barker. The print of Bibles and liturgies belonged to the patent of Robert Barker, the king's printer, and his assignees. In order to defeat this monopoly, Spark imported large quantities of these books from Holland and sold them at much cheaper rates than those printed in London. Barker obtained a warrant to search the ports and seize all the foreign printed Bibles he could find. Spark retaliated by bringing an action for trespass against those who seized the books and went on to import fresh supplies. So is Spark trying to undermine the king's patent? Okay. For theological reasons, Archbishop Laud actively hindered the introduction of Geneva Bibles printed abroad. In August 1645, Parliament prohibited the sale of imported Bibles until these had been examined and sanctioned as correct by the Assembly of Divines. So, what you take from all of that is there a lot of funny business going on in the Bible market? Okay? And you've got people who are trying to capitalize on the money to be made, especially when we see the earlier point of we're talking about upwards of $2.4 million clear profit that was to be had. So if somebody could take a piece of that, were they willing to probably do it? Okay? So Spark's tract was divided into the following sections. Section 1 is Bible for Churches, New Translation, Large Folio. So he's talking about large folio translations of the King James Bible. Second section is Cambridge Bible Folio, then London Bible in quarto, and then he addresses Scottish Bibles. Now, unfortunately, since the technology is not cooperating, I'm just going to have to show this. The University of Library of Michigan, in their digital collections, has the entire piece. How do we pronounce this again? Scintilla? Scintilla. It has the entire piece digitized on their online collections. So I was able to look at it myself, okay? Now, it's fairly long and wordy, so I'm not going to give it all to you in quote, just sort of the more important pieces of it, okay? So time and space will not permit us to quote Spark's tract in its entirety in this lesson, especially since we started 10 minutes late. Consequently, I've selected the most important and pertinent parts for our consideration. Quote, in the year, now listen to this carefully, in the year 1629, the want of these sorts of folio Bibles caused Cambridge printers to print it, and they sold it at 10 shillings in quires, okay? Upon which the then king's printers set 6 printing houses at work, and on an instant printed 1 folio Bible in the same manner and sold it with 500 quarto Roman Bibles and 500 quarto English Bibles, now notice, at 5 shillings a book, okay, to overthrow the Cambridge printing. So according to Spark, is the King's printer directly trying to undersell Cambridge to overthrow the financial investment that they put into that project? Okay? So let me start that over. To overthrow the Cambridge printing, and so to take all in their own hands. It were well if they would always sell at this price. So Spark's saying they don't always sell it at that price. They're intentionally trying to do what? Undersell Cambridge. Okay? Appended to this paragraph is the following marginal note in the Spark piece. Notice what it says. Quote, this folio, which had not been sold under 12 or 14 shillings, if it had not been that Cambridge had printed it. But now they sold it at 5 shillings, which would have been 12 shillings at least, and the 4 to 5 shillings, which was before 9-ish. So in other words, are they selling it for half the price that they were selling it for before the Cambridge editions came out? Actually less than half. Okay? So is that an intentional ploy of market manipulation?
Well, it looks like Cambridge did it first, because if they were selling it for 12 to 14 and they sold it for 10, they undercut them by, a smaller margin. So they
retaliated by cutting that. Okay. Now, these quotes from the pen of Spark speak to one of our previous discussions. London sought to economically undercut Cambridge by publishing a stock of Bibles in 1629 and selling them for less than half their normal price. This is objective evidence of a developing publishing rivalry between the two presses. In the next 2 paragraphs, Spark addresses how the King's printer in London sought to extend his monopoly to control the Bible market. Okay? This is again quoting from Spark now. In former times, our King's printers did agree with Mr. Andrew Hart and after with Mr. John Hart, booksellers of Edinburgh, to serve them London Bibles. So I think he means what we would call Edinburgh. I'm pretty sure. Okay, to serve them London Bibles at lower rates than they sold them at here. So they would not print, whereby they might keep all the privileges to themselves. Since which Robert Young and Miles Flesher most cunningly combined with the King's printers here, and so sunk the printing house there, so that now Scotland is destitute, and by this means books are raised to greater rates here and there likewise. So is he saying that the King's printer is sort of colluding to undermine the printing of the text in Scotland and force them to buy London Bibles? That's the way I understand it. Anybody understand it different? The King's printers, top page 5, the King's printers and others here being interested in the Irish stock, sold Mr. William Blandon of Dublin their stock there at patent, and have so bound him, and he shall not print but what they list of their privilege, so that Scotland and Ireland must grind their mill. Okay? Observe in what a case these be for Bibles, especially if the last decree of the Star Chamber, is how I would say that, have held concerning pricing, for all must be bought at one place to serve 3 kingdoms. So what's Spark saying? He's saying that the King's printer has manipulated the market so that anybody in England, Scotland, or Ireland can only buy from whom? Or only legally buy from him. Only legally buy from London. Okay? In the subsection titled London Bibles in Quarto, Spark states the following regarding the confiscation of imported Bibles by the King's printers. Quote, there have been at least 12,000 of these Bibles quarto with notes printed in Holland and sold very reasonably, and many brought from thence hither. And they have been seized by the King's printers, and the parties that imported them not only lost them, but were put in purgatory, and they're glad to lose their Bibles, and all cost to get off, then the monopolist sold them again, and so to keep others in awe. So the way I understand that is they confiscate the Bibles and then turn around and what? Sell them. Okay? What's that?
It's even better, you don't have the print cost now.
So now they're just sheer profit, right? After discussing the Scottish printings done in Edinburgh, as well as various printings of the Book of Common Prayer, all of which had increased in price, Spark turned his attention to secular works like law books. Quote, "Observe, I pray now, I come to the law books. I have need to break 2 lights into the warehouse, but I perceive then this would raise too biggie." I'm not sure what he means. "I will only nominate 3 books in 3 volumes, so by the 3 you may conceive, the rest." So in other words, he's going to give 3 examples, and he views these 3 examples as emblematic of what's happening with other books. Okay. Then he says the monopolists have not only gotten all the gospel, but also the law as follows. So in other words, he's saying that the monopolists have not only captured the entire Bible market, but by doing that, have they captured the market for these other books too. Okay? In this category, he mentions the following titles. Polton Statutes, Edward IV, Complete Justice, is the way, complete or complete? Complete, right? It's the old spelling. Complete Justice, Grammar of Oxford and Cambridge, Camden's Greek Grammar, and Accidence. Regarding these titles, Spark concludes, quote, "The monopolists keep all others from printing concordances by their patents, and these being printed in another volume beyond the sea, and brought over and sold at half their price, they seize and take them from others, and sell them again themselves, although theirs be not to be had here." Some of this is a little confusing. So have they likewise seized other books printed beyond the seas, when they are not printed here were to be had. So in other words, has Spark testifying that they've basically controlled the entire book market through this monopolistic power. In his conclusion, among other things, Spark appeals to Parliament, quote, "end these crying grievances against the poor, pinched subjects of the crown." So in other words, is the common English man being pinched financially by these activities of the monopolistic power of the king's printer? Okay, that's the idea. So he says, quote, and by the way, throughout this quote, you guys see these like 3.24 and 3.22. Those are, what that is the marginal notes appended to the digital copy of the piece. Okay, he says, "But a touch of this, for is too tart, and I verily believe picks the subject's pockets, and that eats brown bread." Now watch this. To fill the sleeping stationer's belly with venison and sack. I don't know what he means by sack. And robs the commonwealth into still away. And when the sellers by retail get a bob, get not a bob, the monopolists get a shilling. For the octavo genealogy and the 12 of every 4, I'm going to say pounds, they make 15 pounds. And for the 12, what the retailers give 4 pounds, for they will not, if they were to be returned again, should fix shillings for it. I think I should say that's an old spelling of 6. So in other words, is all the benefit going to the monopolist, and are the people having their pockets picked, and the people that are eating the brown bread are filling the belly of the stationers with venison? So in other words, are they living high off the hog while the common people are being pinched and suffering for this? Okay. Then he says in the last paragraph, I hope when the Honorable Assembly of Parliament sees this, as I shall be ready to make proof of all, they will put an end to these crying grievances and help the calamities of the poor pinched subjects. Okay? So Sparks' tract offers some insight into what we have only surmised in the past, namely that there was an economic rivalry between those who were publishing the AV during the 1630s and later. Before Cambridge entered the market in 1629, Robert Barker, the king's printer, held monopolistic control over the marketplace. According to Spark, Barker was willing to wield this power to his advantage, thus impacting the Bible market. So I think the evidence is probably pretty clear about this. Anybody got any comments or questions? So Nate, you brought this up. How do you feel this sort of flies in the face of the narrative?
I think, yeah, especially the Archbishop Abbott's quote, because he was one of the translators, to look on the state of affairs and say the Bible's getting worse, like what he had worked on originally is slowly degrading, and the people working on it are slowly degrading, and then obviously you have
the motivation for it.
Filthy lucre on
Yeah,
top of it.
right. Anyone else want to comment on that? So before moving on, it's important to note that foreign publishers were willing to publish Bibles on the continent and smuggle them into England. Herbert reports that Spark himself was involved in the importation of continental Bibles to undersell the King's printer in London. We already saw that, okay? On page 187 of his catalog, Herbert provides a, quote, note on English Bibles printed abroad, along with the listing of their numbers. His note reads as follows. It will here be convenient to give a list of all the editions of the English Bible cataloged in this volume between the dates 1599 and 1746, which are known or conjectured to have been printed in Holland or elsewhere on the continent. Many of these bear a false imprint, and some probably a false date. Now stop and think about that for a minute. If you were trying to deceive and make it appear as a Bible was printed in London so that it would not get confiscated, would you falsify the title page? Absolutely. Okay? A few are well and correctly printed, but others abound in errors. Differences in typography and peculiarities of spelling afford the best criteria for distinguishing these Bibles from contemporary editions printed in England. Okay? Now go to page 7. And this is where I wish I had the screen. But two examples from Herbert's list are entries H529 and H530, both of which purport to have been published at London in 1638 on their respective title pages. So I gave you a screenshot there on page 7 of one of these Bibles. We have located both H29 and H529 and H530. Look at the title page here, okay? The Holy Bible containing the Old Testament and the New, newly translated out of the original tongues, with the former translations diligently compared and revised by His Majesty's special commandment, and printed at London by Robert Barker, okay? And then notice the year it gives. 1638, right? Okay. Herbert states the following regarding this edition in his catalog. He says, quote, considered to be a spurious edition printed in Holland and published some years after the date given on the title. So this would be an example of a false title page with a false what? Date. Okay, look at the next part of the quote. Mike, we need to remove that second open bullet by Kilburn. We should only have one open bullet. Kilburn, in his tract Dangerous Errors, 1659, evidently refers to this issue when he says, quote, moreover, during the time of the late Parliament, great numbers of Bibles in a large 12, that's I believe folio, volume, were imported from London in 1656 with the false title imprinted at London by Rob Barker, Anno Domini 1638, wherein Mr. Kiffin and Mr. Hills cannot be excused if reports are true, being contrary to the several acts of Parliament of 20 September 1649 and 7 January 1652 for regulating of printing, wherein are so many notorious erratas, which I think is Latin for errors, okay, false English, nonsense, and corruptions, that in reading part of Genesis, I found 30 grand faults, the very importation of the books being an offense contrary to the said statutes, those are the ones that he just quoted, and ought deservingly to be suppressed, which notwithstanding are dispersed in the country as aforesaid. Okay? So in other words, what Kilburn is saying is that are these false printings that have been imported and falsified on the title page and the date.
And they're still distributing.
And they're still distributing them. Okay? Page 8. While not quoted by Herbert, Kilburn's lists some of these grand faults as follows. Okay? So I'm getting this from the Kilburn actual piece. Once again, the University of Michigan Library has digitized Kilburn in its collections, and so we can look at it directly, okay, without having to go through somebody else's source. While not quoted by Herbert, Kilburn lists some of these grand faults as follows. I found 30 grand faults as chapter 27, 16, mouth of his neck, for smooth of his neck. Chapter 29, 13, she, for he ran to meet him. Chapter 30, verse 40, put them unto, for put them not unto Laban's cattle. And in reading Ecclesiastes, Canticles, and the first 27 chapters of Isaiah, I found almost 100 gross faults, which I did specific to the Parliament, and therefore omit them here. And that's directly quoting from Kilburn, okay?
Specific might be specified.
It might be, although, so mark it and I'll check it, okay? So let's look at a couple of these. So I took screenshots of these directly from these editions, okay? So consider the following screenshots mentioned by Kilburn, and we're looking at here at Herbert H. 529. So everybody grab Genesis 27 in your Bible. Grab Genesis chapter 27. Okay, look at verse 16. So I'm going to read from my Bible in verse 16. And she put the skins of the kids of the goats upon his hands and upon the smooth of his what? So this is talking about the deception of... yes, thank you. Now look at this printing. And she put the skins of the kids of the goats upon his hands and upon the mouth of his neck. That makes no sense. Okay? That's just a gibberish reading, right? That makes no sense. So what Kilburn is saying is, see, this is pretty clear evidence that this was printed where? Somewhere else other than where? In England, okay? Go to Genesis 29. We'll just look at a couple of these. Genesis 29 and verse 13. Let's see. Genesis 29, verse 13. We'll start at verse 12 for just a little context. Verse 12. And Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's brother, and that he was Rebekah's son, and she ran and told her father. Now look at verse 13. And it came to pass, when Laban heard the tidings of Jacob, his sister, that he ran to meet him. What? His sister's son, excuse me. And he ran to meet him, and embraced him, and kissed him, and brought him to his house, and he told Laban all these things. Right? Now let's look at this foreign printing. And it came to pass, when Laban heard the tidings of Jacob, his sister's son, that she ran to meet him. No. Who's doing the running here? He is. Okay? So Kilburn is saying this is an obvious what? This is an obvious mistake made by a foreign what? Printer. Okay? And then he also gives Genesis 30, verse 40. It says, And Jacob did separate the lambs, and set the faces of the flock toward the ring straight. Sure. And all the brown in the flock to Laban. Now watch. And he put his own flocks by themselves, and put them not unto Laban's what? Cattle. Now look at the false printing here, okay? And let's just go to the last clause. It says, and put them unto Laban's what? So what word is it missing? Does that change the meaning of that verse?
Yeah.
So page 9. So the conclusion here of all this. So the upshot of all this is that the 17th century English, the upshot of this is that in the 17th century English Bible, I think I have a word missing here. I think I want that to say English Bible market, was very lucrative and fraught with many challenges, some of which include. So I think we can observe the following issues just in this one lesson that we've looked at this. Number 1, inaccurate and uneven publication. Number 2, varied quality. Number 3, price gouging. Number 4, monopoly power. Number 5, competition. And number 6, smuggling and foreign interference. Possibly more. If you can think of another one, I'd be happy to add it to the list. But the idea that the Bible market for the King James Bible was this just pristine market where everybody understood they were handling the word of the Lord and nobody was trying to take advantage of it is just a false historical narrative. It's just not true, okay? All of which impacted the Bible market as it relates to the authorized version for the common Englishman during the 17th century. So, are there a lot of market forces here that are affecting how this thing is being carried out? So there's more we're going to say about this idea of what's going on with the text during this time period, but that sort of exhausted the amount of time that I had as far as putting together these notes, and they already ran into 9 pages. Does anybody have any comments or questions? And or can anybody think of any additional things we need to add to the list there on the last page?
A question on Herbert's catalog. He's saying, these H529, 530 are spurious. How confident are we that he caught them all, given that London was capturing these as they were imported and then reselling them and not necessarily telling anyone, even though they were messed up?
So what he's doing, he's listing it in 1638 because that's what it says on the title page. Mm-hmm. But he's noting that that Kilburn talked about these exact ones that bore these specific printer errors, criteria, and therefore saying that based on the evidence of Kilburn, who was the primary source at the time, that these are probably examples of some of these Bibles that Kilburn was talking about. So I think I have no reason at this point, and that's one reason, Nate, why I gave in this lesson a screenshot of the title page plus 3 of the main examples that he gives from the book of Genesis to show that, these do appear to be, there's no other examples of the King's printer in London making these mistakes in any of the other ones that he printed. So these appear to be one-offs or coming from somewhere else. And there's other evidence that they were sort of seeking to fabricate title pages. I don't think this was the only time that this happens. There was even a plot in the colonies before the American Revolution to possibly try to print one with a falsified title page of the King's printer at that time. Nothing ever came of that, but there's sources that talk about that attempt And they basically didn't have the money to do it. They didn't have the typeface, they didn't have the money, they didn't have the paper, and so nothing ever came of the attempt. But there's other evidence of faked, I hate to say that word, but forged copies that are really coming from other sources. So I think Herbert is correct. And then if you look at, so we have two examples. We have H529, we have H530. In that listing, he gives two more that we can't find. And he gives the specific variants that are found in all of these. And so you can take the data that is given and the variant evidence and look it up and see, okay, this fits this particular listing. So, any other questions or comments?
In more modern times, you know, when you had competing factions, like, you know, if it was during the Depression or whatever, where there was bootlegging, or later on maybe drugs, or who knows, you know, each faction had their enforcers and there was violence. I mean, is there any evidence that back then that there were you know?
So we'll talk about.
I mean,
yeah, I think it was a little bit more highbrow in some cases, but I'm going to suggest to you in 2 weeks. So next week I won't be here, so we're not going to have class. The following Sunday is the Bible conference, so we won't have this class. So the next time we'll have this class is the last Sunday of October, okay? But I'm going to talk about the Wicked Bible. And I think there's some evidence to suggest that the Wicked Bible was sabotage of one press trying to sabotage the other press. Because the King's printer was fined like 300 pounds for making that mistake. And so there's some conjecture out there that possibly agents of the Cambridge press were trying to undermine the King's printer.
But, because like I say, you know, like bootleggers, you know, well, this group wanted to limit it, so they would go smash their stills, but I mean, back then, did somebody go and wreck their, did it get...
No, I think what they did is they confiscated the stock and then they try to resell it for their own profit.
But I mean, it never got to the point where they went and smashed their printers and...
No, not in England, and the problem with some of this is it's happening overseas. So the only way you can control it is to seize it at the port. Okay? But yeah, I don't know of any direct evidence of Cambridge breaking into the King's press and just sabotaging his press or anything like that. I think if that sort of thing happened, it happened through other means. All right.